They fired the man who built everything. 3 weeks later, the whole thing burned down. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside by someone who didn't bother to learn your worth, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens at 3 a.m. inside Titan Grid Technologies will change the way you think about value, loyalty, and the quiet power of someone who never needed to prove a thing. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Part 1. The Man Nobody Counted. The cardboard box wasn't heavy. That was the thing that kept hitting Mason Reed as he carried it down the hallway. How light it was. 6 years at Titan Grid Technologies and everything that officially belonged to him fit inside a single box from the supply closet. A coffee mug he'd gotten at a gas station. A photo of Chloe from her first day of kindergarten, the one where she had syrup on her chin and didn't care. A small screwdriver set in a canvas roll, which he'd bought himself because the company-issued ones were garbage. A spare Ethernet cable coiled at the bottom like a sleeping snake. 6 years. One box. He walked past the server monitoring station without looking at it, past the climate control panel he'd installed himself over a long weekend 3 years ago, when the contractors quoted a price that made the CFO actually laugh out loud, past the row of blinking network indicators that told him, at a glance, everything about the health of the system: temperature, load, latency, the slow pulse of 47 corporate client connections running through Titan Grid's backbone like blood through a body he knew better than his own apartment. He didn't look at any of it. He looked at his daughter. Chloe was 6 years old and she was wearing her yellow raincoat even though it hadn't rained in 2 weeks and wasn't going to rain today. She had decided 2 months ago that yellow was a Tuesday color and she wore it on Tuesdays regardless of weather, forecast, or other people's opinions. It was a Thursday. But the daycare had called at noon to say one of the other kids had a fever and they were short-staffed, and Mason had gotten on his lunch break and driven 20 minutes each way to pick her up. And when Chloe put on the yellow coat, he hadn't said a word about it. She was holding his free hand now, her small fingers wrapped around two of his, and she was looking at everything. The blinking lights, the tall server racks visible through the glass walls of the data center, the long corridor of gray carpet and fluorescent ceiling panels. With the wide-eyed seriousness of a child trying to memorize a place she sensed she wouldn't see again. "Daddy, why are all the lights green?" she asked. "Because the system is healthy," he said. "Like when my doctor checks my ears?" "Something like that." "But you're leaving," she said. Not sad, just noting a fact. She was 6 and she processed things the way 6-year-olds do. Directly, without the social coding adults paste over everything uncomfortable. "If you're leaving, who checks the lights?" Mason didn't answer that. He adjusted the box under his arm and kept walking. Well, he had found out on a Monday, not in person, not from his direct supervisor, Tom Garrett, who had the kind of face that looked permanently braced for impact, not even in a meeting. He'd found out through an email that landed in his inbox at 7:14 in the morning while he was sitting in the break room eating a granola bar and watching the weather, because August was coming in mean this year and Mason always kept an eye on August. The email was from HR. The subject line read, "Restructuring Update, Position Elimination Notice." He'd read it twice. Then he'd finished his granola bar. Then he'd gone back to work for 3 more hours before Tom came by, red-faced and stiff, to have the conversation HR had apparently asked him to have. "The new team's coming in next week," Tom said, sitting across from Mason in the small office off the data center floor, not quite making eye contact. 3 engineers, senior hires, all of them. The idea is to bring in some fresh thinking, modernize the approach. "I know what the idea is," Mason said. Tom shifted. "Look, this wasn't my call. Tom." Mason kept his voice level. "I know it wasn't your call. You don't have to explain it. HR said we'd give you 6 weeks of severance. Yeah, I read the email." A pause. Tom's hands moved to the table and then back to his lap. "I'm sorry, Mason. I am. I know how much you've put into this place." Mason looked at the door. Through the small window in it, he could see the status board, the one he'd coded himself, pulling live data from 17 different system nodes, displaying everything in a clean dashboard that was now the first thing the morning crew checked every single day. He'd built that on a weekend because he was bored and because the previous system was a mess of spreadsheets that nobody updated consistently. Is Diaz on the new team? Mason asked. Tom blinked. What? Kevin Diaz. Is he one of the three they're bringing in? Actually. Yeah, Kevin's one of them. Why? Mason almost said something. He stopped himself. No reason? Good hire. He didn't say the rest of it, that Kevin Diaz had sat across from him at a lunch counter in 2019 and peppered him with questions for 2 hours about thermal distribution in high-density server environments, and that Mason had answered every single question because Kevin was smart and curious and hungry, and that somewhere in the conversation, Mason had essentially handed him the conceptual framework for the approach that Kevin had gone on to build his reputation on. Kevin had sent him a nice LinkedIn message when he got his first senior engineer title. Mason had liked it and never responded. The last 3 days were strange. He trained nobody. Nobody asked him to. The new team was apparently going to be briefed by the third-party consulting firm that had helped design the restructuring plan, and the consulting firm had been given access to TitanGrid's official documentation. And the official documentation was, Mason knew this because he'd written most of it, thorough in the ways that were easy to document and missing everything that wasn't. Documentation could tell you what a system did. It couldn't tell you why a decision was made 3 years ago at 11 o'clock at night when something started behaving strangely and Mason had spent 4 hours chasing it down to a thermal anomaly in a specific server cluster and had built a workaround that was ugly and invisible and exactly right for that particular configuration of hardware and the specific load pattern that TitanGrid's clients generated. That kind of knowledge didn't live in documents. It lived in the back of someone's skull, accumulated over years of watching a system breathe. Nobody asked him to write it down. He almost did it anyway. Started a document on his second-to-last day, typed 3 paragraphs about the thermal management architecture, then sat back and looked at what he'd written and thought about the email he'd gotten on a Monday morning and the 6 weeks of severance and the granola bar, and he closed the document without saving it. He wasn't proud of that. He thought about it later, lying awake at 2 in the morning while Chloe slept down the hall, and he wondered what it said about him. He'd been, his whole adult life, someone who fixed things, who left a place better than he found it, who answered the questions people asked him even when they didn't bother to say thank you. But there was a line somewhere, apparently, and an HR email at 7:14 on a Monday morning was where it was. The lobby had a marble floor and a reception desk that nobody needed because everyone badged in, and when Mason walked through it for the last time with his box and his daughter in her yellow raincoat, the security guard at the front, a heavy-set man named Dale, who had been there longer than Mason, stood up straighter and said, "Hey man, heard you're heading out." "Yeah," Mason said. "Today's the day." Dale looked at him for a moment, then looked at Chloe. "This your girl?" "This is Chloe." Dale crouched down to her level. "Hey, Chloe, you know your dad's the best guy in this building, right?" Chloe considered this. "I know," she said, in the tone of someone confirming a fact that should have been obvious. Dale laughed. He stood up and held out his hand to Mason. They shook. "You take care," Dale said. "You too, Dale." He swiped his badge at the exit turnstile. The light stayed red. His access was already deactivated. He walked around it and pushed through the glass door and stepped out into the August heat, which hit them both like a wall. "Daddy," Chloe said, squinting up at the sky. "It's hot." "It's very hot," he agreed. She tugged his hand. "Is that bad for the lights?" He looked back at the building, glass and steel and the faint hum of systems that ran 24 hours a day, cooling and processing and distributing data across a network that he understood, from its outermost edge to its buried core, better than anyone alive. "Could be," he said. "Come on, let's get some lunch." But Mason Reed had grown up in Clarksville, outside of Nashville, in a house where the AC broke every summer, and his father fixed it himself because they couldn't afford a repair guy. His father was not an engineer, he was a high school shop teacher who believed that if something was broken and you could figure out how it worked, you could fix it, and that this principle applied to everything from lawnmowers to relationships to the human body. Mason had inherited the principle and the stubbornness and not much else, because his father had died of a heart attack at 53, which was the kind of thing that happened to people who worked too hard and slept too little and didn't complain about either. He'd gotten into state school on an academic scholarship and studied computer science, then information systems, then drifted into the specific intersection of hardware and software architecture that most people found either too abstract or too mechanical, but that Mason found the only word for it was satisfying. The way a well-designed system moved data was not so different, he'd always thought, from the way water moved through properly laid pipe. There was an elegance to it that you could feel when things were working right, and a wrongness you could sense when something was off, even before you could identify what. He'd been 24 when he joined Titan Grid. The company was 3 years old and had just landed its first major corporate contracts and was building out the data infrastructure that would eventually become its core product. There was no playbook for it. There was a lot of bad existing infrastructure, a budget that was insufficient, and a series of problems that kept recurring in ways that suggested something fundamental was wrong with the architecture. Mason had taken one look at the existing setup and understood exactly what was wrong with it. He'd written a 12-page memo, single-spaced, no graphics, because he didn't do graphics back then, explaining the problem and proposing a solution. His supervisor at the time had read it, not entirely understood it, and passed it up the chain where it eventually landed on the desk of the company's co-founder, a man named Gerald Hatch, who had enough technical background to recognize what he was looking at. Hatch had called Mason into his office and talked to him for 2 hours, and then told him to build the system he'd described with whatever resources he needed. Mason had built it. It had taken 14 months, working with a rotating team of contractors and one full-time assistant who quit after 6 months because the hours were insane. He'd slept on a cot in the server room twice. He'd rewritten the routing architecture from scratch after the first iteration proved unstable under peak load. He designed the thermal management system himself, on graph paper, because the off-the-shelf solutions didn't account for Titan Grid's specific configuration of hardware density and air cooling requirements. When it was done, Hatch had shaken his hand and told him it was the finest work he'd ever seen. 2 years later, Hatch had retired and sold his controlling interest in the company to a private equity group. The year before Chloe was born, Mason had met Elena at a coffee shop on a Sunday morning. She was a nurse practitioner working nights at Vanderbilt's cardiac unit, and she was in the coffee shop because she'd just gotten off a 12-hour shift, and she needed something to hold in her hand that was warm and strong and not a chart. She had a laugh that was too loud for the space and no apparent intention of making it quieter, and Mason had liked her immediately and completely, the way you sometimes like a person before you've decided to. They'd been married 18 months later. Chloe came 2 years after that. Elena had died when Chloe was 8 months old. An aneurysm, sudden and without warning, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She'd been making coffee. Chloe was asleep in the next room. Mason didn't talk about it. Not with his coworkers, not with the neighbors, not with anyone except, occasionally, at 2 in the morning when he couldn't sleep, with the part of his brain that kept re-examining the architecture of that day, looking for a fault he could have identified, a safeguard he could have built, something preventable that he'd missed. There wasn't one. That was the thing about certain kinds of failures. There was no design flaw to find. There was just the unbearable randomness of a system behaving in a way you hadn't accounted for. He'd taken 6 weeks of leave and come back because the alternative was sitting in the apartment watching Chloe sleep and trying to figure out what came next. He'd come back because the work was something he understood, and he'd needed something he understood. He'd been at Titan Grid for 3 more years after that, and then the private equity group had decided to bring in professional management, and the professional management had hired Vivian Sterling. Vivian Sterling was 30 years old, which was young for a CEO, even by the standards of an industry that occasionally made 25-year-olds into billionaires. She'd built her reputation at her previous company, a mid-sized logistics firm, by identifying inefficiencies and eliminating them with a precision that made investors happy and made the people who embodied those inefficiencies considerably less so. She was brilliant, Mason had heard, sharp, data-driven, impatient with sentiment. She'd sat in on one board meeting that Mason had also been invited to, presenting a technical overview of the infrastructure, and she'd asked questions that were genuinely good questions, the kind that cut through the jargon and got to the actual mechanism. He'd been impressed at the time. She'd arrived in March. By June, she'd approved the restructuring plan. He didn't think she was malicious. He'd spent some time thinking about it, more time than he'd admit. And he kept coming back to the same conclusion. She hadn't done it to hurt him. She'd done it because the data told her one maintenance technician earning a maintenance-level salary could be replaced by 3 high-credentialed engineers who would, by every reasonable metric, deliver more value. The data was wrong, but it was a reasonable thing to believe if you didn't know what you didn't know. That was the problem with certain kinds of knowledge. It didn't announce itself. It didn't have a line on a resume or a certification code or a cost center entry. It lived in a person's head, built over years of proximity to a specific system, and the only way to know it was there was to encounter a problem that required it. They would encounter that problem. Mason knew they would. He'd walked every inch of that system, and he knew exactly where the soft spots were, and he knew exactly what kind of mistake a team of smart, credentialed engineers who didn't know the specific history of that specific infrastructure would make. And he knew what would happen when they made it. He knew all of this, and he'd still close that document without saving it. He wasn't sure what that made him. 12. The apartment was a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that had been built in 1987 and maintained with the minimum effort consistent with city code compliance. The elevator worked most of the time. The hallway smelled like whatever Mrs. Papadopoulos on the 2nd floor was cooking, which was often something with garlic, which Mason didn't mind. He made Chloe a grilled cheese sandwich and cut it diagonally because she'd explained to him at some point that diagonal was better, and he had not found cause to dispute this. She sat at the kitchen table eating it and swinging her feet and asking him questions about what he was going to do now. "Are you going to get another job?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "At another company with lights?" "Probably." She chewed, swallowed. "Can I come to that one too?" "Maybe on Take Your Kid to Work Day." "When is that?" "April, usually." She calculated. "That's a long time." "It is," he agreed. He made himself a sandwich and sat across from her and ate it, and didn't think about the system. He thought about school supplies. Chloe started 1st grade in 3 weeks, and he'd made a list and only gotten through half of it. He thought about the car, which needed an oil change that he'd been putting off. He thought about the pile of mail on the counter that he'd been systematically ignoring because it was August, and August was the month where everything felt slightly more impossible than it did in other months. He didn't think about the system, but he thought about the heat. It was the hottest August in 11 years. That was what the weather stations were saying that week, and Mason believed them. The city felt like it was being slowly baked from the inside, the air heavy and still, in a way that made the evenings only marginally better than the afternoons. People were cranking their AC and leaving it running, and the power grid was under strain that the utility companies were managing with gritted teeth, and the data centers, all of them, not just Titan Grid, were working harder than usual to keep their hardware cool. Heat was the enemy of systems like Titan Grids. It wasn't dramatic, the way a power surge was dramatic. It was slow and patient and cumulative. It found every weakness and pressed on it gently until something gave. Mason knew this. He had built the system's thermal defenses around this knowledge specifically. There was a layer of protection, invisible, undocumented, woven into the routing architecture at a level that looked, if you didn't know what you were looking at, like a redundant process that was doing very little. It was not doing very little. It was doing something very specific and very important, and if someone who didn't know what it was did decided it was inefficient overhead and disabled it, the consequences would not be immediate. They would be slow. They would be the kind that crept up on you while you were busy congratulating yourself on the improvements you'd made. He told himself he wasn't keeping track of how long the new team had been there. He told himself he wasn't doing the math in his head, running calculations he had no business running about systems that were no longer his. He told himself this, and then at night, when Chloe was asleep and the apartment was quiet and the August heat pressed against the windows, he lay in the dark and did the math anyway. Yeah. He'd been out of Titan Grid for 2 weeks when he got a job offer from a competitor, a smaller firm, better culture by reputation, and they wanted him to come in at a senior level with actual authority over infrastructure decisions, not just maintenance. The salary was 40% higher than what he'd been making. He said he'd think about it. He called his friend Marcus Webb, who was the only person in his life who knew anything about both the technical side of his work and the non-technical side of his life, and who was capable of holding both simultaneously without losing one of them. Marcus was a project manager at a construction firm, and he had the specific quality, rare in Mason's experience, of giving advice that was actually about you and not about himself. "Take the job," Marcus said, over the phone, while Mason was washing dishes and Chloe was in the living room watching something with excessive sound effects. "I'm not sure about the commute," Mason said. "The commute? Mason, it's 40 minutes. You drove 40 minutes to pick up your kid from daycare with no notice in the middle of your last day of work at the company that just fired you. They didn't fire me. It was a restructuring. They eliminated your position." "That's what I said." "It's not what you said." A pause. "Mason, take the job. Do something different. You've been at Titan Grid for 6 years, and they let you go in an email and you carried a box and you're standing in your kitchen talking to me about commute times. I'm thinking about it." "No, you're not. You're waiting." Mason didn't say anything. "For what?" Marcus asked. "What are you waiting for?" Mason looked out the kitchen window. The sky was that particular color of late August, washed out, hazy, like it was too tired to be properly blue. "I don't know," he said, which was not entirely true. He knew he was waiting for something. He couldn't say it out loud exactly. But there was a part of him, not the proud part, not the angry part, something more complicated than either of those, that was waiting for the system he'd built to demonstrate its own value, in the absence of the person who had built it. He didn't feel good about that. He put it in the same folder in his head as the document he'd closed without saving and tried not to open it very often. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after his last day at Titan Grid, Mason was at the kitchen table helping Chloe with her reading. She was working through a book about a dog who wanted to be a veterinarian, which both of them agreed had some logical inconsistencies, but the illustrations were good. When his phone buzzed, he glanced at it, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Hey Mason, it's Kevin Diaz. Sorry to reach out like this. Are you available to talk?" He looked at the text for a moment. Then he set the phone face down on the table. "Daddy," Chloe said, "is Dr. Dog a real thing?" "Dogs can't be doctors," he said, "in real life." "Why not?" "They can't read the charts." She thought about this seriously. What if someone read the charts to them? "That's a good point," he said. "Maybe in the future." She seemed satisfied with this. She turned the page. His phone buzzed again. He didn't look at it. He waited 2 days before texting Kevin back. "I'm around. What's going on?" Kevin's response came in less than a minute. "Having some issues with the system, nothing critical yet, but some weird stuff showing up. Can we talk?" Mason sat with the phone in his hands. He thought about what Marcus had said. He thought about the job offer from the competitor, which he still hadn't answered. He thought about 47 major corporate clients connected to Titan Grid's network, their data flowing through a system he'd built, managed by a team of smart engineers who didn't know what they didn't know. "Not really the right guy to talk to anymore," he typed. He sent it, and then he put the phone in his pocket and went to make dinner, and he almost convinced himself that was the end of it. Almost. The next morning he woke up at 5, the way he sometimes did, the way he'd been doing since Chloe was born, and his sleep had rearranged itself permanently around the rhythms of a new and more important human. He lay still for a moment, listening to the apartment, the AC running, the distant sound of traffic, Chloe's breathing from down the hall. And then he got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. He opened his laptop and looked at Titan Grid's public-facing status dashboard, the one that showed external service uptime. It was a simplified version of the internal monitoring system. It told you almost nothing useful. It said everything was green. That was the thing about this kind of problem. It didn't show up on the surface dashboard until it was already very bad. The internal indicators, the ones that had told the actual story of system health, the thermal trends, the load distribution, the subtle timing variations that prefaced more serious events, those weren't visible from the outside. He closed the laptop. He poured his coffee. He sat in the kitchen of his apartment in the August heat and thought about a hidden subsystem, buried in the routing architecture, that existed for one specific reason and that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. He thought about this for a long time. Then Chloe came padding out in her pajamas with her hair going in every direction, and she climbed onto the chair across from him and looked at him with the particular expression she made when she was deciding something important. "Daddy," she said, "can we have pancakes?" He looked at her for a moment. All of his calculations and concerns and the weight of the problem he wasn't responsible for anymore. It was still there, but it sat differently. "Yeah," he said, "we can have pancakes." He got up and got out the pan. Outside, the August sun was already rising, and it was going to be another hot one. And somewhere across the city, in a glass and steel building with a marble lobby and a security guard named Dale, 47 major corporate clients were sending their data through a network that was very quietly beginning to run warm. Part 2. Lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không Việt lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chi dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show More 1626 Part 2. What they didn't know, they didn't know. Kevin Diaz had not changed much in the years since Mason had talked to him over lunch. He was still the kind of person who leaned forward when he was thinking, like his body was trying to get his brain closer to the problem. He was good at his job. Mason had always believed that, and he had the specific confidence of someone who'd earned his reputation through actual competence rather than performance, which was why, when Kevin showed up at Mason's apartment on a Saturday afternoon with a six-pack of beer and the expression of a man who hadn't slept well in several days, Mason knew it wasn't nothing. "You didn't have to come here," Mason said, holding the door open. "You weren't going to talk on the phone," Kevin said. "I know you." That was fair. Mason stepped back and let him in. Chloe was at Marcus's place for the afternoon. Marcus had 2 kids and a backyard and a trampoline, and Chloe treated Saturday afternoons there as a non-negotiable calendar event. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it only got when she was gone. Kevin sat at the kitchen table and opened 2 beers without asking and pushed one across to Mason, which was the kind of presumption Mason would have found annoying from most people and didn't mind from Kevin because Kevin was generally right about what he was doing. "Talk," Mason said. Kevin wrapped both hands around his beer and looked at the table. "You know what we've been doing over there." "I know what I'd guess you've been doing. We've been optimizing." He said it the way someone might say we've been making a mistake, which suggested he'd started to suspect those two things were the same. Streamlining the load distribution, cutting what looked like redundant processes. The system was running better on paper after the first 2 weeks. Metrics were up. Vivian, the CEO, she was happy. Richardson was practically throwing a party. "Who's Richardson?" "VP of Operations, Philip Richardson. He's the one who pushed the restructuring." Kevin paused. "He's the one who made the case to Vivian that one maintenance tech wasn't worth keeping when they could bring in a proper engineering team." Mason drank his beer. "We removed a process," Kevin said. He kept his eyes on the table. "About 10 days ago. It was sitting in the routing layer, pulling resources, not doing anything obvious. We ran it through 3 separate analysis tools, and all 3 said it was inactive overhead. So we flagged it as a legacy artifact and disabled it." The kitchen was very quiet. What process? Mason asked, even though he already knew. Kevin looked up. I don't know what it does. That's why I'm here. I've spent the past week trying to understand what it does, and I can't. There's no documentation. There's nothing in the codebase comments. It's just, it's there, or it was there, and now it's not. And since we disabled it, the thermal readings in cluster 7 have been drifting. How much? 2 to 3 degrees over baseline, slowly, every day, a little more. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck. It could be nothing. It could be the heat. But it doesn't feel like nothing. Mason set his beer down. He looked at the window. The afternoon light was coming in at a flat, washed-out angle, the kind of late summer light that didn't warm anything. It's not nothing, he said. Kevin's jaw tightened. What is it? Mason thought about the document he'd closed without saving. He thought about the 12-page memo, single-spaced, that he'd written at 24 years old. He thought about 14 months of construction and 2 nights sleeping on a cot and graph paper and a thermal model he'd designed by hand because nothing off the shelf had fit. It's a thermal regulation buffer, Mason said. I built it into the routing layer because the primary cooling system in Cluster 7 has a latency issue under sustained load. The cooling kicks in reactively, not proactively. Under normal conditions, it doesn't matter. Under peak conditions in summer, extended high load periods, the cluster temperature starts to climb faster than the cooling response can keep up. The buffer process redistributes load across 3 secondary clusters, dynamically, to keep the thermal curve flat. Kevin stared at him. It wasn't documented, Kevin said finally. No. Why wasn't it documented? Mason picked up his beer. Because I built it at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night when the cluster started running hot, and I needed to solve it. And I was the only one there, and I fixed it, and then I went home and slept 4 hours and came back and fixed something else, and somewhere in there documenting it fell off the list. He paused. And then I forgot it wasn't documented because I knew it was there, and I didn't need to look it up. Kevin closed his eyes briefly. Okay, he said. How hot is it running now? Cluster 7 is sitting at 4 degrees above baseline this morning. In August, Mason said. In August, Kevin confirmed. 4 degrees above baseline in August, without the buffer, during the hottest stretch of weather in 11 years. Mason ran the numbers in his head without meaning to. It was reflexive, the way some people did arithmetic when they were nervous. The thermal curve without the buffer was non-linear under sustained load. It didn't climb steadily. It climbed slowly at first, and then, past a threshold, it climbed fast. Kevin, he said, how many clients are running peak load right now? Most of them. It's August. Everyone's systems are under strain. How many are running sustained peak? Not spikes. Sustained. Kevin thought about it. Probably 35, 40 of the 47. The financial ones, definitely. The healthcare networks, 2 of the logistics clients. He stopped. That's bad, isn't it? It wasn't a question. Re-enable the process, Mason said. That's the first thing. Tonight, not tomorrow. What if it doesn't? It will, but you have to re-enable it and then watch the curve. If the cluster is already past a certain temperature threshold, the recovery will be slower than the original suppression. You might need to manually throttle the cluster 7 load for 48 hours while the temperatures come back down. Kevin was already pulling out his phone. I need you to come in. No. Mason, Kevin, I don't work there. I know you don't work there. Kevin leaned forward, forearms on the table, and his voice was the voice of someone who was trying very hard not to sound as worried as he was. But I'm telling you that I am looking at a situation that I don't fully understand, involving a system I didn't build, and the person who built it is sitting across from me, and he knows exactly what I need to do. He stopped. I'm not asking as a coworker. I'm asking as someone who should have called you 3 weeks ago before we changed anything, and didn't, and I'm sorry about that. Mason looked at him. Re-enable the process, he said again. Watch the curve. If it's not responding by tomorrow morning, call me. Kevin nodded. He drank the rest of his beer in one long pull, and he left, and Mason sat at the kitchen table in the quiet apartment and looked at his hands and thought about sustained load and thermal curves and 47 clients and the August heat pressing down on a city that had no interest in cooling off. Kevin called on Sunday morning at 7:43. It's responding, he said. The curve is flattening. Cluster 7 is down 2 degrees from last night. Good, Mason said. He was standing at the stove making pancakes. Again. Chloe had developed a view that Sunday was a pancake day in the same way Tuesday was a yellow coat day, and Mason had not found grounds to argue the point. But we've got a new problem, Kevin said. Mason waited. Richardson found out I reached out to you. He's not happy about it. Why does Richardson care? A pause. Because he's the one who put together the case for the restructuring. He built the proposal that eliminated your position. If it comes out that we had to call you a week into the new setup because we broke something, Kevin stopped. It doesn't look good for him. Mason flipped a pancake. Not my problem. He's telling the team that the thermal issue was unrelated to the process we disabled. He's saying it's the heat, external factors. He wants us to document it that way. Mason set down the spatula. He kept his voice even. Kevin, the process we disabled was the cause of the thermal drift. You know that. I know that. Then document it accurately. I work for Richardson. You work for the company. Silence on the line. Then Kevin said quietly, It's not that simple. Mason understood that it wasn't. He'd been in enough organizations to understand the specific gravity of a VP who had staked his credibility on a decision and would spend considerable energy ensuring that the record reflected well on that decision. It wasn't malicious, exactly. It was the thing that happened when someone's professional identity got tangled up with a choice they'd made, and the choice turned out to be wrong. I re-enabled the process, Kevin said. That's on the record. I logged it this morning. Good. But Mason, another pause. The system it's not the same, even with the buffer running again. The load patterns have shifted since we made the other changes. Some of the optimization we did, it moved traffic in ways that are creating pressure in different places. I'm not sure we put everything back the way it was. Chloe appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, squinting at him. He held up one finger. She sat on the floor next to the kitchen doorway, which was where she waited when he was on the phone, with the patience of a 6-year-old who had learned that phone calls ended eventually. Send me the current load distribution report, Mason said. The raw data, not the dashboard. You're not supposed to have access. Kevin! Right, okay, I'll send it to your personal email. He sent it. Mason looked at it that afternoon while Chloe watched her show, and what he saw in the numbers was a system that had been changed in several places at once, by people who understood each individual change but hadn't been able to anticipate the cumulative effect of all of them together. It was like rerouting rivers. You could redirect each one and have it make perfect sense in isolation, and then watch the flood come from somewhere unexpected because the water had to go somewhere. The system was under stress in 3 places he could identify immediately. Maybe more that he'd need more data to see. The thermal buffer being re-enabled had helped. It hadn't fixed everything. He wrote a 3-paragraph email to Kevin laying out what he saw and what he'd recommend, and then he sat with his finger over the send button for about 30 seconds, and then he sent it. The response came back in 12 minutes. Thank you. This is exactly what we needed. Passing to the team now. Richardson is going to lose his mind when he sees this, but I'll deal with that. K. Mason put his phone away. He'd told himself he was done. He'd told himself the email was the last thing. He told Marcus, when Marcus called on Sunday evening to report that Chloe had eaten 3 plates of food and beaten his son at a board game twice, that he'd given Kevin the information he needed, and the rest was their problem. So you're helping them, Marcus said. I sent 1 email. You looked at the load distribution data and sent a 3-paragraph diagnostic. Kevin asked, Mason. Marcus's voice was patient and slightly tired, in the way of a person who had been friends with another person long enough to recognize a pattern. What do you want to happen here? Mason thought about it. He was standing at the window of his apartment, and the city was still hot, even at 8 in the evening, and the streets below were the particular Sunday night version of quiet that felt like the whole city exhaling before another week. I want the system to work, he said, which was true, but it wasn't all of it. And, Marcus said, and nothing. That's it. Marcus didn't push it. He was good at not pushing things. He said goodnight and hung up, and Mason stood at the window a while longer. And then he went and checked on Chloe, who was asleep with one arm hanging off the mattress at an angle that looked deeply uncomfortable and apparently wasn't. He straightened her blanket. He went back to the living room. He opened his laptop and looked at the load distribution numbers again, and he started running through scenarios in his head, and he was still doing it at midnight when he finally put the laptop away and told himself to sleep. The week that followed was the kind of week that looks calm from the outside. Kevin sent updates every day or two. The thermal readings in Cluster 7 were improving. The load distribution adjustments Mason had suggested were helping. Richardson was apparently minimizing the whole thing internally, describing it as a routine calibration issue. Nothing significant, part of the normal optimization process. The new engineering team had handled it well, was the story. Everything was under control. On Tuesday, Mason accepted the job offer from Titan Grid's competitor. He sent the email, and then he went to pick up Chloe from her first week of first grade, and she spent the entire drive home describing a girl in her class named Priya, who could already read chapter books and whose shoes lit up when she walked. And Mason listened and asked questions and felt, for the first time in a few weeks, like the weight of Titan Grid was sitting somewhere he could put it down. He started the new job paperwork. He called the oil change place and made an appointment. He went through the mail on the counter. On Thursday, Kevin called. Not a text this time. A call, which Kevin generally didn't do, which meant something had changed. "We have a new issue," Kevin said. His voice was flat in a way that Mason recognized as the voice of a person controlling something more urgent beneath the surface. "What happened?" "The optimization we did on the secondary routing table, the one that redistributed traffic from the eastern cluster. It created a dependency conflict with the failover protocol. I found it this morning. If the primary routing fails for any reason, the failover doesn't activate cleanly. It tries to hand off to a secondary path that we modified, and the handshake fails." Kevin stopped. "That means in a failure scenario, there's no automatic recovery." Mason sat down. "How long has that dependency been broken?" "Best I can tell, since we made the routing change, 8 days. 8 days. During which the system had been running under peak August load, with a thermal buffer that had been disabled for 10 days before that and was still recovering." He did the math again. He didn't want to, and he did it anyway. "Kevin," he said, "does Richardson know about this?" "I told him this morning." "What did he say?" A long pause. "He said to document it as a low-priority technical debt item and schedule a review for next quarter." Mason put his hand over his mouth. He stayed very still for a moment. "He said what?" "He said the system has been running fine. The system has been running fine because it hasn't had a primary routing failure in the past 8 days. That's not the same as fine." Mason stood up. He was doing the thing he did when he was really thinking, walking slowly in a tight circle around the kitchen, which he'd been doing since college and still couldn't stop. "Kevin, if you lose primary routing right now, under current load and current temperatures, and the failover doesn't activate—" "I know," Kevin said. "I know exactly what happens. 47 clients. I know. This isn't a low-priority item. I know." Kevin's voice had dropped. "I'm not going to document it that way. I'm telling you that Richardson is—" He stopped. "Richardson is managing a narrative right now, and the narrative is that the new team has improved the system. And I'm the guy who keeps finding problems that don't fit the narrative." "You're the guy who's doing his job," Mason said. "Yeah, well," Kevin sounded tired. Not the tired of one bad night, the tired of something that had been accumulating. "You want to know something? When I got this offer, I looked at who the previous infrastructure guy was. I looked up your name. I found 2 papers you'd co-authored and the patent filing for the routing architecture, which I'd studied in grad school. I didn't know you were the Mason Reed from those papers. I showed up here thinking I was following in the footsteps of someone serious." He paused. "I wasn't expecting to be calling him 3 weeks later from the middle of a mess." Mason stopped walking. "You studied the routing paper?" "Every serious network engineer in the country has read that paper, Mason." There was something strange about hearing that. Strange and quietly terrible in a way he hadn't expected. He'd written that paper 8 years ago and co-filed the patent and then gone back to work and not thought much about it. because the work itself was more interesting to him than what people thought about the work. Fix the failover protocol, he said. That's the priority, not the narrative, not Richardson. If I escalate this over Richardson's head, Kevin, fix the failover protocol. A breath. Okay. And send me the current failover config. I want to see what you're working with. Mason. I know, Mason said. I know I don't work there. Send me the config. Kevin sent it. Mason spent that evening at the kitchen table going through it, with Chloe doing her reading homework at the other end of the table, occasionally looking up to tell him something important about the dog veterinarian book, which had a new character now, who was a cat that didn't trust doctors, which Chloe found both funny and understandable. I don't really like going to the doctor either, she told him. I know, he said, but it's important. Why is it important if you don't like it? He looked up from his laptop. She was watching him with that direct waiting expression she had, where she genuinely wanted to know the answer and wasn't going to let it go. Because some things are too important to let the uncomfortable parts stop you, he said. She thought about this, decided it was satisfactory, and went back to her book. Mason went back to the failover config. He found the dependency conflict within 20 minutes. It was exactly where Kevin had said it was, and it was the kind of problem that was obvious once you knew the system's history and completely invisible if you didn't. The fix was not complicated, but it required understanding the original handshake logic, which wasn't documented anywhere Kevin would have access to. He wrote it out. Every step. The logic behind each command, not just the commands themselves. He wrote it the way he'd write something for someone who was smart, but who hadn't been in the room when the decision was made, which was how he should have written everything, years ago, all along. He sent it to Kevin at 11:30 that night. Kevin's response came back at 11:42. This is exactly what we needed. We'll implement first thing tomorrow. And Mason? Thank you. I mean it. Mason closed his laptop. He sat in the dark apartment and listened to the August heat and thought about 47 clients and a failover protocol that wasn't working, and a VP who was calling it low priority, and a system that was, by his best read of the numbers, operating with less margin than anyone in that building fully understood. He thought about the new job, the paperwork on the counter, the fresh start that was sitting there, available, waiting for him to walk toward it. He thought about all of it, and then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and he didn't sleep well. And in the morning, the heat was already back before 7, pressing down on the city like it had no intention of letting up. Part 3. Louis? Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hối thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, tri dân bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội trữ, dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 16 giờ 30 phút Part 3. The Night Everything Fell. Kevin implemented the failover fix on Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon the configuration was stable, and Mason told himself that was the end of his involvement. He spent the weekend doing the things that needed doing: oil change, grocery run. A long Saturday afternoon at the park with Chloe, who had decided she wanted to learn to ride her bike without training wheels and spent 2 hours launching herself down a small slope with a determination that made Mason's chest ache in the specific way that watching your kid be brave always did. She fell 6 times. She cried once, briefly, after the 4th fall, and then wiped her face with the back of her hand and got back on. On Sunday, he signed the new job offer paperwork and sent it back. On Monday morning, he woke up to 3 missed calls from Kevin, all between 2 and 4 a.m., and a text that said only, "It's happening, the whole thing. Call me." He called. Kevin picked up on the first ring. His voice had the particular quality of someone who had been awake for many hours and had moved past the stage of being tired into something that was just pure forward motion, running on adrenaline and the pressure of a situation that had stopped being theoretical. "The system went down at 11:47 last night," Kevin said. "Full cascade failure. Cluster 7 overheated past the critical threshold. The thermal buffer wasn't enough to compensate because the load was already too far into the red. And when it failed, it took primary routing with it. And the failover fix," Mason said. "Did you implement it Friday?" "Yes, it partially worked. The handshake activates, but the secondary path is overloaded now because it's carrying everything Cluster 7 dropped. It's not built for that load." Kevin's voice was strained in a way Mason had never heard from him before. "We've been trying to get clients back online for 3 hours. Every time we stabilize one cluster, another one spikes. We rolled back 2 of the optimization changes, and it made things worse because now the load distribution doesn't match the current routing table." Mason was already out of bed. He was standing in the middle of his bedroom in the dark, the phone against his ear, his brain doing the thing it did when it was fully engaged, going quiet, all the background noise dropping away, just the problem filling the space. "How many clients are down?" "All 47. All of them." "How long has it been fully down?" 3 hours and change." "What's the current state of Cluster 7? "Temperature is still elevated. We shut down non-critical processes to reduce load, but we can't bring it fully back online at current temps." "Did you physically check the cooling units? Not just the software readings, the actual hardware?" A pause. "I don't think anyone's been in the physical server room." "Kevin, someone needs to go in the physical server room." Okay, I'm sending someone right now." Mason grabbed his jeans from the chair. He put the phone on speaker and set it on the dresser. "What engineers do you have there right now?" "Me, Torres, and Fam. Richardson is here. Vivian is on her way in." "Vivian is coming in personally?" "She's been on the phone with 3 board members for the past hour." Kevin's voice dropped slightly. "Mason, we have a financial services client that is hemorrhaging money every minute this is down. 2 healthcare networks that are running on backup systems that won't hold past morning. A logistics company that has trucks sitting idle because their dispatch software is hosted on our platform." He stopped. "The financial exposure is already in the 7 figures." Mason pulled on a shirt. He picked up the phone. "Okay, listen to me. Don't touch the routing table again until you know the exact current state of every cluster, not just 7. Run a full status pull. All 12 clusters, current temperature, current load, current active connections. Do that first before you change anything else. Every time you change something without the full picture, you're flying blind." Okay, yes. "Can you—" Kevin stopped. "What? Can you come in?" The apartment was quiet. Chloe's bedroom door was closed at the end of the hall, and behind it she was asleep, and she had school in 6 hours, and Mason had a neighbor, Janet Kowalski in 3C, who had watched Chloe before in emergencies without being asked twice. "I'll call you back in 5 minutes, he said. He knocked on Janet's door at 2:43 in the morning. She answered in a bathrobe, took one look at his face, and said, "Go. I'll be there in 2 minutes." "I don't know how long—" "Mason, go." He went back to the apartment and checked on Chloe, who was asleep on her back with her arms out to her sides like she was falling in slow motion. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he wrote a note and left it on the kitchen table where Chloe would see it in the morning. A note that said, "Had to go fix something. Janet is here. I love you. There are waffles in the freezer." And he grabbed his keys and his gray hoodie from the hook by the door and left. The city at 3 in the morning had a particular quality that Mason had always found clarifying. The streets were not empty. There were always people, always movement. But the noise was stripped down to something essential, and driving through it felt like moving through a problem that had been simplified to its core. He parked in the Titan Grid lot at 317. He had no badge, no access card. He stood at the lobby entrance and called Kevin, and Kevin buzzed him in, and when Mason walked through the glass doors for the first time since the day he'd walked out of them with a cardboard box and a 6-year-old in a yellow raincoat, the marble floor looked exactly the same. And Dale wasn't at the security desk because it was the middle of the night, and the building was short-staffed, and none of the usual landmarks of the place landed the way he'd half expected them to. He didn't have time to feel anything about it. That was, he realized, a relief. Kevin met him at the elevator. He looked exactly like a person who had been managing a catastrophe for 3.5 hours. Not panicked, not defeated, just ground down to something functional and raw. He shook Mason's hand and led him down the hallway without preamble, which Mason appreciated. The operations center was the kind of controlled chaos that Mason recognized from his worst nights at Titangrid. Multiple monitors running simultaneously, 3 engineers at workstations, the remains of coffee cups and energy drinks clustered on the edges of desks. The main status wall, the dashboard he'd coded years ago, was a field of red and amber indicators with a narrow strip of green at one edge that looked like it was losing ground. Torres and Pham both looked up when Kevin came back in. They registered Mason and something shifted in their expressions. Not resentment, or not only that, but the particular look of people who have been trying to solve something for hours and have just seen someone walk in who might actually know the answer. Mason Reed, Kevin said simply. He built this system. He's going to help. Neither Torres nor Pham argued. This was not, Mason would think later, because they were gracious. It was because at 3 a.m, with 47 clients down and a VP standing in the corner with his arms crossed, grace was a luxury and they were past it. Philip Richardson was not past it. He was 51, a broad-shouldered man who carried his authority in his posture, and when he saw Mason walk in, his face went through several things in rapid succession and settled on something that was controlled and cold. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I wasn't aware you'd been contacted." "He's here to help," Kevin said, without turning around. "He doesn't work here." "Phil." Kevin did turn then. His voice was even. "We have 47 clients down. We've been at this for 3.5 hours and we're losing ground. He built the system. He's here." He held Richardson's gaze for a moment. "We can have this conversation later." Something moved across Richardson's face. He didn't say anything else. He moved to the side of the room and stayed there, watching. Mason went to the nearest workstation. "Full cluster status," he said. "Pull it up." Torres swiveled and ran the pull. The data came up on the main screen at all 12 clusters, current readings, and Mason looked at it the way he'd looked at it 1,000 times over 6 years, and he saw the problem in about 45 seconds. It wasn't just Cluster 7. That was the fire everyone had been watching, and while they'd been watching it, 3 other clusters had quietly developed problems of their own. Cluster 3 was running hot. Not critical, but climbing. Clusters 9 and 11 were carrying load they hadn't been designed for because the rerouting from 7's failure had pushed traffic toward them, and the optimization the team had done weeks earlier had removed a load balancing process from both of them that would otherwise have managed the overflow. The system wasn't in one place. It was coming apart in 4 places at once, and every fix the team had attempted had addressed one place while inadvertently stressing another, because they were working without a map of the whole. "Okay," Mason said. He pulled a chair to the workstation. He was aware of everyone in the room watching him, and he didn't pay attention to it. "Here's what we're going to do. We're not going to touch Cluster 7 yet. It's still too hot, and anything we do there is going to be unstable. We're going to focus on 9 and 11 first because those are the ones with active client connections that can be restored. Torres, I need you on 9. I'm going to walk you through re-enabling the load balancer. It's in the system, it's disabled, not deleted, and it'll take about 12 minutes to bring back up cleanly. Pham 11 is yours. Kevin, you're watching the temperature curves on everything. Don't let me get focused on one problem and miss something moving somewhere else." "What about 7? Pham asked. "7 comes last. We need the rest of the system stable before we try to bring it back. If we rush 7 and it fails again under full load, it'll take everything back down with it." Pham nodded. Torres was already at his station. Richardson stepped forward from the wall. "Mr. Reed, I'd like to understand your methodology here before—" "Philip." Mason didn't raise his voice. He didn't look up from the screen. I'm going to ask you to give me 90 minutes. If what I'm doing isn't working in 90 minutes, you can tell me to stop and I'll leave. Right now I need everyone in this room focused, and I need you to let me work. A silence. The hum of the servers. The quiet click of keyboards. 90 minutes, Richardson said. He stepped back. Vivian Sterling arrived at 3:51. Mason was aware of the door opening behind him and a change in the quality of the room's attention, the subtle shift that happened when someone with authority walked in. But he didn't turn around. He was in the middle of walking Torres through a command sequence that had to be exact, and he didn't have space to manage anything else. Run the second command, wait for the confirmation prompt. Don't hit enter on the third one until I say go, Mason said. Tell me when you see the prompt. I see it, Torres said. Hold. He was watching the load curve on cluster 9. It needed to dip below a specific threshold before the next command would seat properly. It was dipping. Almost. Now, Mason said. Torres hit enter. The curve on 9 flattened, not dramatically. It was a small, decisive movement on a graph, the kind of thing that looked like nothing to someone who didn't know what it meant. To Mason, it meant 18 of the 47 clients had a viable path back online. Good, he said. Flag those 18 for restoration. Kevin, start the reconnection sequence on them. Torres, stay on 9 and watch for any spike above the new baseline. He heard someone behind him say quietly, "Who is that?" And Kevin's voice also quiet. "That's Mason Reed. He built the system." A pause, then a woman's voice, controlled and precise. "Why is he here and not on our payroll?" Mason kept working. He brought Cluster 11 stable 22 minutes after 9, walking FAM through the same logic with different specifics, because 11 had a slightly different configuration that FAM hadn't known about, and Mason had built in himself during a hardware upgrade 2 years ago. When 11 came up clean, another 14 clients had a path to restoration. 32 of 47 back in play, Cluster 7 still down. 3.5 hours to get here. 2 hours and 11 minutes of Mason working the problem. He finally turned around. Vivian Sterling was standing near the back of the room. She was wearing dark slacks and a blazer over what looked like a shirt she'd pulled on quickly. She had the put-together quality of someone who had managed to look composed despite being woken up and called in at 2 in the morning, but she hadn't quite made it to fully composed. There were the small tells, a tiredness around her eyes that the posture couldn't hide, hair that was slightly less controlled than it probably was in daylight. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile, not grateful, something more complicated and more careful than either. "Miss Sterling," he said. He wasn't sure why he addressed her directly. It just felt like the right thing to do. "Mr. Reed," she said, "Kevin tells me you built the original infrastructure." "Yes. He also tells me the recovery process you're using relies on system logic that isn't documented anywhere in our files." "That's right." She looked at him steadily. "Why isn't it documented?" It was a fair question. It was the question he'd been carrying around for weeks, the one he'd been answering for himself in different ways every time he lay awake at 2 in the morning. He gave her the honest version. "Because I was the only person who needed to understand it, and I always understood it. And at some point that became a problem I didn't see because I was too close to it." He paused. "That's on me. Partially. There are other parts of it that are on other people, but that part is mine." Something moved in her expression. She didn't respond immediately. Richardson spoke from the side of the room. "Vivian, the recovery is progressing well. I think—" "Phil." Her voice was quiet and exact. "I'll talk to you in a minute." Richardson closed his mouth. She looked back at Mason. "How long to bring Cluster 7 back up?" "An hour, maybe 90 minutes. It's a more complex recovery because it failed hardest, and it's the one with the thermal management issues. We need to cool it down and bring the load back up in stages." "Walk me through it." He looked at her. "You want the technical version?" "I want whatever version tells me what's actually happening to my system." He walked her through it. Not the simplified version, the real one. The thermal buffer, why it existed, why it wasn't documented, what the engineering team had done when they removed it, what had cascaded from there. She asked 3 questions during the explanation, and all 3 questions were good ones. the kind that went straight to the mechanism without getting distracted by the peripheral details. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been developing?" she asked. "The thermal drift started when the buffer was disabled, about 10 days ago. The load distribution issues started when the routing optimization went in, around the same time. The failover dependency conflict has been there since the routing table was modified." He kept his voice neutral. "The system has been degrading for approximately 2 weeks. It reached a failure threshold tonight because the load is at seasonal peak, and the outside temperature means the physical cooling infrastructure is working at its limit." She absorbed this. Her face was very still. "The failover fix," she said. "Kevin implemented that Friday?" "Yes." "On whose instruction?" "Mine." She turned and looked at Kevin. He met her gaze without flinching, which Mason respected. "I asked Mr. Reed for help identifying the issues," Kevin said. "Off the record. I documented the fixes I implemented as my own work." "Why off the record?" Vivian asked. Kevin glanced at Richardson. It was not an accusatory look. It was just a look that contained information. Vivian followed it. She looked at Richardson for a long moment. Richardson's face was doing something careful and complicated. "We'll talk," she said to him. The two words had a weight to them that made the room feel smaller. She turned back to Mason. "What do you need to bring 7 back up?" "Time and clear access to the systems. No changes made by anyone else while I'm working. Everything routed through me." "You have it." She looked at the room. "Kevin, Torres, Pham, you work with Mr. Reed. You do what he says. No other system changes without his authorization. Is that understood?" 3 voices confirmed it. She looked at Richardson one more time. "Philip, conference room." Richardson straightened. For a moment, he looked like he was going to say something, to Mason, or to Vivian, or to the room in general. And then he didn't. He followed her out. The door closed behind them. Kevin let out a slow breath. Torres made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Pham just shook his head. "Okay," Mason said. He turned back to the screens. "Let's talk about 7. Cluster 7 was the most complex recovery he'd done in years. It wasn't technically impossible. Nothing that had happened was irreversible, which was the thing about systems he'd always found, underneath everything, reassuring. But it required a precise sequence of steps that built on each other, and any one of them done out of order or in the wrong state would mean starting over. He walked the team through it while doing most of the critical work himself, narrating as he went. Not because he was performing, but because he'd realized, somewhere in the past hour, that the narration mattered. Torres and Pham and Kevin were good engineers. They were sitting here in a crisis because they'd been handed a system without the context to understand it, not because they were incompetent. Narrating his decisions meant the next time, because there would be a next time, that was the nature of systems, they would have something he hadn't given them before. At one point, Torres stopped him. "Why are you running the thermal check before the load restore? I'd have done it after." "Because if you restore load to a cluster that's still cooling, the new load spikes the temperature before the cooling unit can compensate, and you get another spike event. You want the cluster cold before you ask it to work again." He pulled up the temperature graph and showed him. "See the curve. You want it below this threshold. If you start load restore at this point instead," he traced the line, "you end up here." Torres looked at the graph. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, that makes sense." That was the thing that kept happening, in the middle of the crisis, that Mason hadn't expected. The small moments of actual teaching, in between the emergency. He'd been doing it automatically, and it was only when he noticed Kevin taking notes that he registered it consciously. Kevin was taking notes. At 4:58 in the morning, Cluster 7 came back online. The status wall shifted, red to amber to green, moving across the display in a slow wave as the client connections restored, one after another, the numbers climbing, 32, 38, 42, 45, 46. 47, Torres said. He said it quietly, like he wasn't sure it was real yet. The room was quiet for a moment. Not a celebratory quiet. Nobody cheered, nobody high-fived. It was the quiet of people who had been in a prolonged high-stress state and were now in the first few seconds of it releasing, which was its own kind of strange. Kevin looked at Mason. All 47, Kevin said. Mason looked at the status wall. All green. The system was running. Not perfectly. There were still load patterns that needed work, still documentation to write, still an audit to do of every change that had been made over the past 3 weeks. But it was running. The clients were online. The bleeding had stopped. His phone said 5:03 a.m. He thought about Chloe waking up in 2 hours and finding his note on the kitchen table and the waffles in the freezer. He thought about Janet in 3C, who was sleeping on his couch, probably because that was the kind of person Janet was. He thought about the new job paperwork sitting on his counter. "I need to go home," he said. Kevin nodded. He looked like he had a great deal more to say and was saving it. "Yeah, of course." Mason stood up from the workstation. He picked up his hoodie from the back of the chair. He was aware peripherally that Vivian had come back into the room at some point in the last hour. He'd heard the door and hadn't turned, and that she was standing near the back wall and had been watching him work. He turned now. She was standing with her arms crossed, not in the defensive way, in the way of someone who was holding something together internally. She looked like she had had a long night and was nowhere near the end of it, and her expression when she looked at him was something he still couldn't entirely read. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Miss Sterling." "The system is stable?" "For now. There's work that still needs to be done. Documentation, a full audit of the changes made in the past 3 weeks, some load balancing that needs to be revisited, but the immediate crisis is resolved." She nodded slowly. She looked at the status wall. All green, 47 clients, 5 in the morning. "Thank you," she said. She said it without qualifier and without the kind of caveat that people sometimes attach to thank yous to hedge them. Just the 2 words, said directly. "The team did the work," Mason said. "Kevin, Torres, Pham, they were here all night." "I know. I'll thank them too." She paused. "I mean specifically what you did. What you came in here to do at 3 in the morning when you no longer have any obligation to this company." She looked at him. "I'm aware of what that cost you." He didn't know what to say to that. He put on his hoodie. "I'll send Kevin a write-up of the remaining issues," he said. "The documentation that needs to be done. It'll take me a couple of days." "Mr. Reed, the new team can handle it with the right information. They're good engineers." He glanced at Kevin, who was watching this exchange with an expression that was carefully neutral. They just needed the context they weren't given. He said goodnight to Kevin and to Torres and to Pham, and he walked out of the operations center and down the long corridor and past the server monitoring station that still told him everything about the system at a glance, and through the lobby where Dale's desk sat empty, and out through the glass doors into the pre-dawn August air. It was still warm, but there was something different about it. The specific quality of the air at 5 in the morning that wasn't cooler exactly, but felt less relentless than it did at noon or even at midnight. Like the night was admitting, finally, that morning was coming. He sat in his car for a minute before starting it. His hands were on the steering wheel. He was tired in a way that went past the physical, the particular tired of a long night of concentrated problem solving, of being fully present in a crisis for hours on end. He thought about the status wall going green. All 47. He started the car and drove home through the empty streets, and when he got back to the apartment, Janet was asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled up, and Chloe's bedroom door was still closed, and the note he'd left was still on the kitchen table. He picked it up and threw it away. He made coffee, quietly, and sat at the kitchen table and drank it in the dark. And at 6:47, Chloe came padding out in her pajamas and stopped in the doorway and looked at him. "You came back," she said. "I came back," he said. She climbed onto the chair across from him, the same way she always did. She looked at him with the same evaluating expression she'd had on her face the morning she'd asked about the lights. "Did you fix it?" she asked. He thought about Cluster 7 coming back online, 47 going to green. Kevin's voice saying all 47 in the quiet room. "Yeah," he said. "I fixed it." She nodded, satisfied, as if this were exactly what she'd expected all along. "Can we have waffles?" she asked. "The waffles are in the freezer," he said. "I left you a note." "I know, but you're here now." She looked at him. "You're better at waffles than the freezer ones." He looked at her for a moment, then he got up and got out the waffle iron. "Part bon lui tam?" Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cắm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dẫn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Showmore 16 giờ 34 phút Part 4 What the Records Show. Good. He slept 4 hours and woke up feeling like the inside of a server room after a crash. Functional, barely, with a lot of cleanup still needed. Chloe was at school. Janet had left a note on the counter that said, "You look terrible. Sleep more. Jay," which was Janet's version of affection. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a few minutes, letting the previous night settle into something he could look at from a slight distance. His phone had 14 notifications. He ignored 12 of them and read the two from Kevin. The first sent at 7:30. All systems holding, client stable. No degradation overnight. We're monitoring every 15 minutes. The second, sent at 8:45. Vivian wants to meet. I told her you'd need time. She said whenever you're ready. No pressure, her words. Mason looked at that second message for a long time. Then he put the phone face down and drank his coffee. No pressure. He turned that over in his head. Vivian Sterling had built her reputation on precision. She didn't say things without meaning them, and she didn't add qualifiers she didn't intend. If she'd said no pressure, she probably meant it, which meant whatever she wanted to discuss was something she'd thought through and decided to approach carefully. That told him something. He wasn't sure yet what. He spent the morning doing what he'd told Kevin he would do, writing up the documentation. He opened a new document and started typing, and this time he didn't stop. Every system he'd built that wasn't documented, every decision that existed only in his memory, every piece of architecture that the team had nearly dismantled without understanding, he put it in writing. Not as a performance of helpfulness, not because anyone was watching, because it needed to exist outside of his head, and keeping it there had caused real harm, and that was a thing he needed to fix. He wrote for 3 hours. It was 11 pages, single-spaced by the time he was done. Not 12 pages like the first memo he'd ever written at 24, close enough to that number that he noticed it. He sent it to Kevin. Kevin responded in 4 minutes. Mason, thank you. This is everything we needed 6 weeks ago. A pause, and then, I know. He took the meeting with Vivian 2 days later, on a Wednesday morning, at a coffee place 3 blocks from Titan Grid. Her choice of location, which he appreciated, on neutral ground, off her turf, and off what had been his, just 2 people at a table. She was already there when he arrived. She was the kind of person who was always already there, he suspected. The kind who built buffer time into everything and used it to be early rather than just on time. She had a black coffee and a legal pad, and she was writing something when he walked in, and she looked up and stopped writing and put the pen down with the specific decisiveness of someone setting aside one thing to give full attention to another. Mr. Reed, she said. Miss Sterling. He sat down. He ordered coffee when the server came by. He waited. She didn't fill the silence with preamble. He liked that. I've spent the past 2 days going through everything, she said. The restructuring records, the original proposal, the engineering assessment that was used to justify eliminating your position. She looked at him steadily. I also pulled the original infrastructure documentation from when Gerald Hatch was still running the company, the design specs, the patent filing. Okay, he said. You know what I found? I have a guess. She turned the legal pad slightly toward him. It had a list on it, written in neat, compressed handwriting. He glanced at it without picking it up. Names, dates, a few numbers he recognized as budget line items from the restructuring. Philip Richardson put together the case for the restructuring, she said. I knew that. I approved it based on his assessment. What I didn't know, what I should have known and didn't, was that the engineering assessment he presented to me was incomplete in specific ways. She paused. He knew what your role actually was. There are internal emails. He'd been briefed, before the restructuring proposal, on the infrastructure architecture and the fact that you were its original designer. Mason's coffee arrived. He wrapped his hands around the mug. He left that out of the proposal, Vivian said. It wasn't a question. What did he put in instead? A cost-benefit analysis showing that a team of 3 senior engineers could perform your function for the same cost as your salary, while adding capacity for new development work. She looked at the legal pad. It was a well-constructed argument, internally consistent, every number checked out. She paused. It just didn't include the fact that the person being replaced had built the system from the ground up, and that his institutional knowledge was not replaceable by credential. Mason thought about Richardson standing in the corner of the operations room with his arms crossed, watching. He thought about low-priority technical debt item, schedule a review for next quarter. He thought about the thermal buffer that had been in the routing layer for 3 years, doing its specific invisible job until a team of smart engineers decided it was inactive overhead. Why? He said. What did Richardson get out of it? Vivian set her pen down on the table. He'd been pushing for an infrastructure modernization initiative for 2 years. He wanted to bring in a team he'd worked with before, engineers he had existing relationships with. Hatch always said no because the system was working. She looked up. When I came in, I was new. I was looking for inefficiencies. Richardson put together a proposal that looked like exactly what I was looking for. He used you, Mason said. He said it plainly, not to wound. Something moved across her face. Yes, she said, equally plain. He did, and I let him, because I didn't look hard enough at what I wasn't being told. A pause. That's on me. He looked at her. This was, he thought, not an easy thing for her to say. Not because she was proud, he didn't get that read from her, but because she was precise, and admitting an error of that magnitude and that level of detail required a precision about her own failures that most people didn't bring to self-examination. What are you going to do about it? He asked. Richardson is no longer with the company as of yesterday morning. She said it without satisfaction, just fact. I'm working with legal on the specifics of his departure. The engineers he brought in, Kevin, Torres, Pham, they keep their positions. None of this is their fault, and they've done good work under bad circumstances. She picked up the pen again, not to write, just to hold. I'm also doing a full review of every restructuring decision made in the past 6 months to see what else was shaped by information I wasn't given accurately. Mason nodded slowly. That's going to take a while. It is. She looked at him. Can I ask you something directly? Sure. When Kevin came to see you, when you started helping from outside the company, you knew this was going to fail, didn't you? The system. You could see it coming. He was quiet for a moment. The coffee shop had the low ambient noise of a mid-morning Wednesday. A few laptops, a conversation at the counter, the sound of the espresso machine. Normal sounds. Nothing at all like the operations room at 3 a.m. I could see the risk, he said. I didn't know for certain it would fail. I thought if Kevin got the right information in time, maybe they could stabilize it without the full collapse. He paused. I was trying to help without coming back. I didn't want to come back. Why not? He looked at his coffee. Because I'd already left. Because it wasn't my problem anymore. Because... He stopped. He started again. Because there's a version of going back that's about ego. About proving something. I didn't want to be that. I wasn't sure if I could do it without being that. She was quiet for a moment. Were you? I don't know, he said honestly. Some of both, probably. She seemed to accept this. She looked out the window at the street, and for a moment she looked less like a CEO and more like a person who had had a very hard 2 days and was still in the middle of processing them. I owe you a formal apology, she said, not just for the crisis, for the original decision, for approving a restructuring that eliminated a position without understanding what that position actually was. She looked back at him. I was working with the information I was given, but I also didn't ask the right questions. I should have. Mason thought about the email at 7:14 on a Monday morning, the cardboard box, Chloe's hand in his in the lobby. It's done, he said. I'm not carrying it. She held his gaze. I'd like to talk about what comes next, she said. I figured. I'm offering you your old position back. Or rather, she paused. Not your old position. That position doesn't cover what you actually are to this company. I want to create a new role. Senior VP of Infrastructure Architecture. Full oversight of the entire system, authority to staff your own team, budget for the documentation and modernization work that should have been done years ago. She put the pen down again. I'm also prepared to offer a compensation package that reflects the actual value of what you do, which I now understand is considerably different from what we were paying you. She slid a folded paper across the table. He looked at it without picking it up. What's the number? She told him. He looked at the paper for a moment. Then he picked it up and unfolded it. The number was at the top, and below it were the specifics. Reporting structure, budget authority, team size, a few other terms. It was a serious offer, not a gesture. He folded it back up. I need to think about it, he said. She didn't push. She nodded once. Of course. I already accepted another offer, he said. I'll need to unaccept it if I take this. I don't love doing that. I understand. And there are conditions. He put the paper in his jacket pocket. If I come back, I have authority over infrastructure decisions, not advisory authority, not recommendations that go up a chain and get modified, actual authority. That's what I'm offering. I'd also want to bring Kevin on as my direct report, with a title that matches what he's actually doing. He managed that crisis well under conditions that weren't his fault. Something shifted in her expression, a small, genuine thing. I already planned to adjust Kevin's title and compensation. You didn't need to ask for that. I know. I wanted you to know I was asking for it anyway. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he now had enough context to read. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more like recalibration, the look of someone adjusting their map of a person to account for new information. There's one more thing, he said. What? Full documentation of everything, not just the system, the decision-making, why things were built the way they were, the reasoning, not just the result. I want that to be a standard going forward, not something we scramble to produce in a crisis. Agreed, she said, without hesitation. He looked out the window. A woman was walking a dog that kept stopping to sniff things, and she kept stopping with it, patient, not pulling the leash, which was a small thing to notice, but he noticed it. I'll give you an answer by Friday, he said. Take the time you need. He finished his coffee. He put on his jacket. He stood up from the table, and he was about to say goodbye when she said, Mr. Reed, and he stopped. Your daughter, she said. Chloe. Kevin mentioned. She paused slightly. I just wanted to say that I understand what you left to come in that night, what it cost to walk out the door at 3 a.m. He looked at her. He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to say, and that wasn't it. She was fine, he said. She had a neighbor. She had waffles. I know, Vivian stopped, which seemed to be something she didn't do often. I wanted to acknowledge it. He nodded. He said goodbye and walked out into the street, and the August heat hit him the same way it always did, heavy and immediate, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about Chloe asking, Did you fix it? With the confidence of someone who already knew the answer. He called Marcus from the car. She offered you the job, Marcus said, before Mason had said anything except hello. How did you... Because that's what was always going to happen. Marcus sounded like a man who had been patiently waiting for a conversation to catch up to where he'd been sitting for 2 weeks. What did you say? I said, I'd think about it. Mason, I already accepted the other offer. Unaccept it. It's not that simple. It actually is, Marcus said. You call them, you explain that your circumstances changed, you apologize, you offer to help with the transition. They'll be annoyed and they'll move on. That's it. Mason stopped at a red light. He watched a kid on a bicycle cut through the intersection, too fast, completely confident, not even looking at the light. The kid made it fine. Mason's heart rate went up anyway. She apologized, he said. Vivian, properly. How'd that land? He thought about it. Strange. Good strange. He paused. She's not what I expected her to be. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone easier to be angry at. Marcus laughed, short and real. Yeah, that's always a problem. You want to take the job? The light turned green. Mason drove. I want to know the system is going to be okay, he said. I want to know that what I built is that it's going to be taken care of properly, documented, understood, not just patched when it breaks. And you think going back is the way to make that happen? I think I'm the only person who can make that happen right now. Maybe in 2 years there are other people who understand it well enough. But right now, then you've already decided, Marcus said. Mason didn't say anything. Mason, you've already decided. He probably had. He'd probably decided somewhere around the moment he sat at the kitchen table in the dark at 5 a.m. and thought about the status wall going green and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was not pride exactly. More like the particular satisfaction of a system working the way it was designed to work, which was the closest thing to peace he'd ever found in this work, or maybe anywhere. The new job people are going to be annoyed, he said. Yes, Marcus agreed. I hate doing this to them. I know. And I'm going back to work for the company that fired me. Restructured, Marcus said, with the specific tone of someone who had heard this word used as a euphemism enough times to find it faintly absurd. Right. On completely different terms. Yes. With full authority and a compensation package that reflects your actual value, and a CEO who apparently just apologized to your face and meant it. Mason pulled into the school pickup line. He was 20 minutes early, but he always arrived 20 minutes early because the alternative was being late, and he was constitutionally incapable of being late to pick up Chloe. Yeah, he said. That's about right. Then I don't know what the problem is, Marcus said. The problem is that it shouldn't have taken a catastrophe. A silence on the line. Then Marcus, more quietly, No, it shouldn't have. But it did, and here you are. Another pause. Are you going to let it be enough? Mason sat in the pickup line. The school doors weren't open yet. Around him, other parents were doing the same thing, sitting in their cars, on their phones, listening to the radio, waiting. The ordinary machinery of a Wednesday afternoon. I'm working on it, he said. He said goodbye to Marcus and put the phone in the cup holder. He sat in the line and watched the school doors and thought about Friday, which was when he'd told Vivian he'd give her his answer, which was the same day he'd need to call the other company and unaccept the offer he'd accepted. He thought about the documentation he'd written that morning. 11 pages. Everything that should have existed from the beginning. He thought about Torres asking why he ran the thermal check before the load restore, and the way the graph had made the answer obvious once you could see it, and how Torres had said, "Okay, that makes sense," in the voice of someone who would not make that mistake again. He thought about Kevin taking notes. The school doors opened. Kids poured out in the particular organized chaos of 3:30 in the afternoon, and Mason scanned the crowd the way he always did, looking for the yellow raincoat on a Tuesday, the specific way Chloe walked, which was slightly too fast and slightly too purposeful for someone who was 6, like she was always heading somewhere and already running a little late for it. He spotted her near the middle of the crowd. She wasn't wearing the yellow coat, it wasn't Tuesday, but she had a drawing in her hand, held up and slightly away from her body the way she carried things she was proud of, protecting them from the general chaos of other children without making a production of it. She found his car and came toward it and got in and buckled herself, and then held up the drawing. It was a house, with a very large sun above it and a figure in the doorway that had a circle for a head and lines for arms and legs, and was, Mason could tell by the absence of a ponytail, supposed to be him. "My teacher said to draw my home," Chloe said. "I drew you in it." He looked at the drawing. The figure in the doorway had lines coming off it in every direction. Not sun rays, more like. He didn't know. He asked. "Those are the things you know," Chloe explained. "Like all the things in your brain that go out into stuff." She looked at the drawing with the evaluating expression she reserved for her own work. "It's like when you fix the lights." Mason looked at the drawing. His daughter had drawn him as a figure radiating knowledge into a house, which was not how he would have described himself, and was also, he thought, not entirely wrong. "I like it," he said. "Can we put it on the fridge?" "Yes," he said. "We can put it on the fridge." He pulled out of the line and drove home, and the afternoon heat was still sitting heavy on everything, and his phone had a notification from Kevin that said the system had held stable through another full business day with no degradation, and his jacket pocket had a folded piece of paper with a number at the top of it. He thought about everything he still needed to do and everything he needed to decide, and then he thought about none of it, and instead he asked Chloe about her day, and she told him about a spelling test and a disagreement at lunch, and a new fact she'd learned about elephants, which was that they could recognize themselves in mirrors. "How do they know that?" Mason asked. "They put a dot on their head," Chloe said, "and then the elephant looks in the mirror and touches the dot, because it knows it's looking at itself." "Huh," Mason said. "It's smart," Chloe said, "knowing it's you." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window with the drawing still in her lap, held carefully, the figure with the radiating lines facing up toward the roof of the car. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He drove the rest of the way home without the radio, just the sound of the city and the particular quiet of a car with one adult and one child who had run out of things to say and was content, for the moment, to just be going somewhere together. The drawing sat in her lap the whole way. When they got to the apartment, she carried it up the stairs with both hands, like it was something that mattered. He held the door open for her. She walked in like she owned the place, which she did, in the only way that counted. Part 5. Louis A. Viết sao nghiên đến sao nghiên nằm trong two liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện uyển ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phủ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hồi thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi vào cụm từ AI điển hình. Việt như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show More 1641, Part 5, What Gets Built After. He called the other company on Thursday morning. The hiring manager's name was Sandra Ochoa, and she'd been warm and professional through the entire process, the kind of person who made you feel like they were genuinely rooting for you rather than just filling a position. Mason had liked her. He still liked her, which made the call worse. "Sandra," he said, "I need to talk to you about the offer." A pause on her end. The particular quality of a pause from someone who already knows what the next sentence is going to be. "Okay," she said, "I'm going to have to withdraw. I know that's—" He stopped. "I'm sorry. I know what this does to your timeline, and I'm genuinely sorry for it. My circumstances changed in a way I didn't anticipate." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is this Titan Grid?" He blinked. How did you... Mason. Word travels in this industry. We heard about the crash. We heard you went in and fixed it. Another pause. We figured you might get an offer you couldn't turn down. He didn't know what to say to that. Can I ask, Sandra said, are they treating you right? Actually right, not just with a big number? He thought about Vivian at the coffee shop, setting her pen down to give him her full attention. The legal pad with the list. I should have asked the right questions. I think so, he said. I think they're going to. Okay, Sandra said. Then I hope it works out. And if it doesn't, she left it open in a way that meant something. You know where we are. He thanked her and hung up and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, feeling the specific discomfort of having done the right thing in a way that still cost someone something. That was the thing nobody told you about integrity. It didn't always feel clean. Sometimes it felt like two things in tension and you just had to pick the one you could live with longer. He texted Vivian. I'll take the role. We should talk about start date and terms. Her response came back in 3 minutes. Thank you. Coffee tomorrow. Same place? Yes, he wrote back. He put his phone on the counter and looked at the drawing on the fridge, the figure in the doorway with the radiating lines, the very large sun. He stood there looking at it for probably longer than was necessary, and then he went to make his bed, because it was a Thursday and the bed needed making and the work wasn't going to wait. The Friday meeting was different from the Wednesday one, less tentative. They'd both shown up having made their decisions, and now it was about the specifics. And specifics were the kind of thing Mason was good at and Vivian was apparently also good at, which meant the conversation moved fast. They worked through the terms in an hour. Start date was 2 weeks out. He needed time to close out his affairs, get Chloe's school schedule sorted, talk to Janet about the occasional early morning. The title was Senior VP of Infrastructure Architecture. The reporting structure put him directly under Vivian, which she'd proposed and he'd accepted without argument because the alternative was reporting to someone who would need him to explain himself constantly, and he didn't have the patience for that anymore. Your first priority, Vivian said, will be the full audit, every change made in the past 3 months. I want to know the actual state of the system, not the documented state. Those are different things right now. I know. That's why it's the first priority. Kevin and I can have a preliminary report in 3 weeks. Full audit will take 6 to 8, depending on what we find. She wrote something on her legal pad. What about the team? Torres and Pham? Keep them. They're solid. He wrapped his hands around his coffee. They got handed a situation without context, and they did the best they could with what they had. That's not a character failure. That's an information failure. He paused. We fix the information problem and they'll be good engineers. Vivian looked at him. You're not angry at them? No. Some people in your position would be. Some people in my position, Mason said, would spend a lot of energy being angry at people who didn't deserve it and less energy fixing the actual problem. That seems like a bad trade. She looked at him with the recalibrating expression again. He was starting to recognize it as the look she made when someone said something that didn't fit her existing model, and she was updating the model instead of dismissing the information. There's something I want to ask you, she said. She set down the pen, which he'd learned meant she was shifting from the operational conversation to something else. And you can tell me it's not your business. Okay? When Kevin first reached out to you, when you could see the system was heading toward trouble, why didn't you come back right then, before it crashed? You could have. He thought about it. He'd thought about it a lot in the past week. Because I didn't work there, he said. Because I'd drawn a line and I was trying to respect it. Because... He stopped. He started over. Because there was a part of me that needed it to fail, not to hurt anyone. Not because I wanted the clients to suffer, but because I needed the system to demonstrate its own value in a way that the spreadsheet hadn't captured. He looked at the table. That's not something I feel good about. Vivian was quiet. People were affected, he said. The clients, the team, they all had a worse week because I was trying to prove something, even if I wasn't fully admitting that's what I was doing. He looked up. I needed to say that out loud to someone. I figured it might as well be you. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you for saying it. Don't thank me. It's just accurate. Accuracy is rarer than you'd think, she said. And then, after a pause, I have my own version of that. I approved the restructuring because I wanted to believe the data I was given, not because I couldn't see the gaps in it, because I didn't want to see them, because seeing them would have required slowing down a process I was excited about. She looked at the legal pad. I had been at Titan Grid for 4 months. I wanted to show results. Richardson gave me a fast result that looked good, and I took it. She paused. That's my version of what you just said. Mason looked at her. There was, he thought, something unusual about sitting across from a CEO who was willing to say that plainly. He'd worked with enough people in positions of authority to know that the reflex was usually the opposite, to find the version of events that preserved the decision's logic, to locate the blame somewhere in the system rather than in the choice. It wasn't weakness, the admission. It was the opposite. Then we're both starting from the right place, he said. She almost smiled. Not the polished professional expression, something smaller and more real. I suppose we are. They finished the meeting 20 minutes later and shook hands in the street outside, and Mason drove home and picked up Chloe from school, and they made tacos for dinner, which Chloe insisted on assembling herself and which fell apart immediately. And they ate the deconstructed versions directly off the plate, and both of them agreed this was fine. Chap. His first day back at Titan Grid was on a Tuesday. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore, dark jeans, a plain shirt, a jacket he'd bought 3 years ago that still fit. He didn't think about it much. He parked in the lot and walked into the lobby, and the marble floor was the same, and the reception desk was empty, the same as always. And Dale wasn't at the security station because Dale's shift started at noon. Kevin was waiting at the elevator. He looked different than he had the night of the crash. Less ground down, more settled. The specific quality of someone who had come through something difficult and landed on the other side of it. He'd been promoted, officially, 3 days ago. Director of Network Operations. It was the title that matched what he'd actually been doing, minus the chaos. You ready? Kevin said. Let's take a look at the audit list, Mason said. They took the elevator up together and Kevin briefed him on where things stood, which systems were stable, which were still showing stress patterns, what the team had already flagged for review. Mason listened and asked questions and took a few notes on his phone, which was his whole system for note-taking and always had been. No notebooks, just a running memo that he culled every Sunday morning. The operations room looked different than it had at 3 in the morning during the crisis. Cleaner, quieter, normal hours calm. Torres looked up from his workstation when they came in and gave Mason a nod that contained something complicated, acknowledgement and a trace of residual embarrassment, which Mason understood and didn't make anything of. Torres, Mason said, how's 9 looking? Stable, holding at 2 degrees below the new baseline. Good, let's keep an eye on the load curve this afternoon. I want to see how it behaves at peak. I've been watching it, Torres said, and then, I've been watching it every afternoon since you showed me the graph. Mason looked at him. That's exactly right, he said. He went to work. The audit took 7 weeks. Not 6, not 8. 7, which felt right in the way that honest timelines usually did, expanding slightly past optimism and contracting slightly from fear. He and Kevin and Torres and Pham went through the system layer by layer, the way you'd go through a building someone had renovated without a permit, not assuming the worst, but also not assuming everything visible was structurally sound. They found 4 additional places where the optimization changes had created instabilities. None of them were as severe as the failover issue, but 2 of them would have caused significant problems within the next 6 months, quietly, in the way of problems that don't announce themselves until the pressure is already bad. They fixed all of them. And as they fixed each one, Mason documented it. Not just the fix, but the reasoning. Why the original architecture had made the choices it made. What conditions it was designed to handle. What would happen under what circumstances. He wrote it in language that a competent engineer who hadn't been in the room for the original decisions could understand and follow, which was the standard he should have been writing to all along. By the end of the audit, the documentation for Titan Grid's infrastructure had gone from a collection of incomplete records and tribal knowledge to a living, structured system document that was, for the first time in the company's history, actually accurate. Kevin put it in the shared drive on a Wednesday afternoon and sent a company-wide email describing it as a major milestone in infrastructure transparency. Mason read the email and thought that was a generous way to describe something that should have existed 6 years ago, but Kevin was right that it was a milestone, and Mason was learning, slowly, to let things be milestones even when they arrived late. The thing about going back to a place you'd left was that you expected it to be stranger than it was. You expected the accumulated strangeness to land on you in waves, the desk that was different, the people who looked at you differently, the knowledge that you'd been gone and now you weren't. Mason had expected this and braced for it, and then it mostly didn't happen, and the not happening of it was its own adjustment. The work was the same work, the system was the same system. What had changed was the context, the title, the authority, the compensation, and the specific quality of walking into a room where decisions were being made and having the standing to make them. That last part was new, not entirely comfortable yet, but new. There was a meeting in his third week, a quarterly review with the senior leadership team, the first one he'd attended in that capacity. He sat at the table instead of being the person who occasionally got called in to explain something technical and then left. He'd presented the audit findings, 15 minutes of actual information delivered without jargon, and the room had been quiet in the way rooms got quiet when the information was both clear and sobering. Afterward, one of the board members, a woman named Elaine Park, who had been on the board since Hatch's era, had stayed behind and found him in the hallway. "You were here before," she said. It wasn't a question. 6 years, Mason said. She looked at him with the particular attention of someone who was recalibrating. "I remember when Hatch talked about the infrastructure architect. He talked about him the way engineers talk about work they genuinely respect." She paused. "I didn't make the connection until I saw your name on the agenda." "Not many people did," Mason said. "That was partly the problem." She nodded slowly. "Well, I'm glad you're back." She said it simply, the way Dale had said you take care. Not a corporate formula, just a person saying a true thing. "Thank you," he said. He went back to his desk and kept working. Mtiant. Vivian and Mason found a rhythm over those first weeks that was partly professional and partly something harder to name. The rhythm of two people who had started from a place of mutual damage and were building something functional on top of it. It wasn't seamless. She had strong opinions about growth strategy, and occasionally those opinions ran ahead of what the infrastructure could actually support. And Mason told her so directly, and she pushed back and they argued, sometimes with an energy that left Kevin visibly uncertain about whether to stay in the room. She was not easy to work with. He hadn't expected her to be. She was fast and demanding, and she retained information from 3 meetings ago and brought it into the current meeting in ways that meant you could never assume she'd forgotten anything you'd said or anything you'd avoided saying. She expected the same precision from other people that she held herself to, and she wasn't particularly patient when she didn't get it. Mason held his own. He'd been doing precise work for long enough that he didn't need to perform it, and the specificity she demanded was the same specificity he'd always brought to everything. Not because anyone was watching, but because imprecision was the thing that caused failures, and failures were the thing that kept him up at night. After a particularly difficult meeting in the 5th week, where they'd spent 90 minutes arguing about a proposed expansion of the client base that Mason had concerns about and Vivian had plans for, Kevin had come into Mason's office afterward and sat down without being asked. "Is she always like that?" Kevin said. "Like what?" Kevin made a gesture that encompassed the general experience of the last 90 minutes. "Like that." "Yeah," Mason said. "I think so," Kevin nodded. "Okay," he said, with the specific acceptance of someone recalibrating their expectations. "How do you handle it?" Mason thought about it. "She's not wrong about the growth," he said. "She's moving faster than the infrastructure can currently support. But the infrastructure can get there. My job is to tell her accurately what it takes and how long it takes, and then actually do it in that time." He paused. "Her job is to hold me to it." Kevin looked at him. "You actually don't mind her." "I don't mind people who are direct," Mason said. "I mind people who aren't." "Richardson was direct," Kevin pointed out. "Richardson was performing directness," Mason said. "That's different." Kevin sat with that. Then he said, "How do you tell the difference?" Mason looked at the window. Outside it was October now, the heat finally broken, the sky doing the particular thing it did in early fall, where it looked like someone had turned up the saturation. Too blue, too clear. The kind of sky that felt like compensation for August. Richardson was direct about conclusions, he said. Vivian is direct about her thinking. She shows you how she got there. That means she can be wrong and update. Richardson was never wrong. That's how you know. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's going in my notes." Mason looked at him. "You're still taking notes." "I take notes on everything," Kevin said, slightly defensive. "Is that a problem?" "No," Mason said. "It's exactly right. Keep doing it." Oh, he thought about Richardson sometimes. Not often, and not with the kind of sustained anger that would have been easier in some ways. Anger being at least a consistent emotional state, something you could point at and name. What he felt about Richardson was more complicated than anger, and he turned it over occasionally the way you turned over a problem you hadn't fully solved. The thing was, Richardson hadn't been stupid. He'd been smart, and he'd been strategic, and he'd understood organizations the way some people understood code, how to move through them, how to shape the environment in your favor, how to present information in the format that produced the outcomes you wanted. Those were real skills. They just weren't skills that were compatible with running an honest organization, and eventually the dishonesty in the method had produced a dishonest outcome, and when the outcome collapsed, it had taken Richardson's career with it. There was a lesson in there somewhere. Mason wasn't sure he was the right person to articulate it cleanly, because he was too close to it, and because he wasn't the kind of person who went around articulating lessons. But when he sat in meetings now, and watched Vivian make decisions, watched the specific way she handled information she didn't want to hear, not dismissing it, not managing it toward a conclusion she'd already reached, just absorbing it and thinking, he thought he understood something about the difference between organizations that worked and ones that didn't. It wasn't about intelligence. It wasn't even about values exactly. It was about whether the people at the top of a structure could tolerate accurate information about the structure. Most couldn't. They thought they could. They believed they were the kind of leader who wanted to hear hard truths, but put an actual hard truth in front of them and watch. Most of them shaped the record in their favor without even fully recognizing they were doing it. Vivienne, to her credit, genuinely didn't. He'd watched her revise her own assumptions 3 times in as many weeks, in rooms full of people, without making it look like anything other than what it was. It was one of the most unusual things he'd ever seen in a leadership context, and he didn't tell her that because it would have been strange, and also because she probably already knew. In November, Chloe turned 7. The party was in the apartment, which was too small for 12, 6, and 7-year-olds, and was therefore exactly as chaotic as Mason had known it would be when Chloe insisted on 12 invitations. Janet helped. Marcus showed up with his kids and a gift-wrapped box that turned out to contain a book about animals that could recognize themselves in mirrors, which Chloe received with the expression of someone who had just been given something they didn't know they needed. "It's got elephants," Marcus told her, crouching down to her level. "I know about elephants," Chloe said seriously. "They touch the dot." "There's more to it than the dot," Marcus said. "The book explains." She looked at the book cover. Then she looked at Mason. "Can I read it at the party?" "After the party," he said. She put it carefully on the counter, away from the cake and the other kids, in a spot where it would be safe. Kevin came, which surprised Mason and probably shouldn't have. He'd mentioned the birthday in passing, offhand, the way you mentioned things to people you spent most of your waking hours working alongside, and Kevin had shown up with a gift card and a bottle of wine and the specific slightly lost expression of a person who had arrived at a children's birthday party and was recalibrating. "There are a lot of children here," Kevin said, standing at the edge of the living room. 12, Mason said. "Why 12? Chloe made a list." Kevin looked at the chaos. "She's thorough," he said. "She is," Mason agreed, with the particular pride of a father who recognized his own qualities reflected in his child, and felt, about this, something too large and too complicated to name. Vivian had sent a card. Just a card. Not flowers, not a gift. A card in a small envelope with Chloe's name on the front in handwriting that was precise and slightly angular. Inside it said, "Happy birthday, Chloe. I hear you're very good at asking important questions. That is the most useful skill there is. V. Sterling. Mason had read it twice and then given it to Chloe, who had read it once, decided she liked it, and put it with the mirror book on the safe counter. "Who's V. Sterling?" Chloe asked. "Someone I work with," Mason said. Chloe thought about this. "Is she nice?" Mason considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "She's honest," he said, "which is better than nice." Chloe seemed to find this satisfactory. She went back to the party. The thing about value, real value, not the kind on a spreadsheet, was that it didn't announce itself. Mason had known this his whole life, in a professional sense, had built his career on the specific kind of work that held systems together invisibly, that prevented failures rather than fixing them in ways that generated metrics and visibility and credit. The work of prevention was always going to be undervalued relative to the work of repair, because repair was dramatic and visible, and prevention was invisible by definition. If you did it right, nothing happened. And nothing happening looked, on paper, like nothing was being done. This was not a new problem. It was probably as old as work itself. The person who maintained the bridge never got the credit. The person who rebuilt it after it fell got, even though maintenance was the thing that made repair unnecessary. He'd understood this abstractly for years. What the past few months had done was make him understand it differently, not just as a professional frustration, but as something with actual human stakes. The maintenance tech who never got credit had a daughter and a cardboard box and a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like garlic from the 2nd floor. And when the bridge fell, he was the one they called at 3 a.m. He thought about this not as a complaint. The complaint was finished, he'd set it down, he was done with it, but as something he wanted to not repeat, not just for himself, for Torres, who was learning to check thermal curves every afternoon, for Kevin, who took notes on everything, for Fam, who had fixed cluster 11 at 4 a.m. without knowing exactly why the fix worked, and who now knew exactly why it worked, and would know forever. The documentation existed. The knowledge was no longer in one person's head. If Mason left tomorrow, walked out the door, took Sandra Ochoa's job, moved somewhere entirely, the system could run without him. Not perfectly, not immediately, but with enough information for the people who remained to understand what they were working with and why. That was, he thought, the thing that had needed to be true all along and hadn't been. Not because he'd been protecting his position, he didn't think that was it, or at least not mostly, but because the work of building and the work of documenting had always felt like different work. And the building had always been more urgent, and the documenting had kept getting pushed to later until later became never. He'd fixed it. He'd fixed the actual problem, not just the symptom. He wasn't sure he'd have done it without the crisis. That was uncomfortable to admit, but the crisis had clarified something that years of smooth operation hadn't, that invisible work only stays protected when the people in authority understand what they're looking at, and you couldn't assume they would understand it. You had to build that understanding deliberately, the same way you built everything else, intentionally, structurally, with documentation and context, and the patience to explain yourself to people who hadn't been in the room when the decisions were made. He'd spent 6 years assuming everyone understood what he was doing because he understood it. That was the mistake. Not the only mistake in the story, not the largest one, but his. He owned it. He moved on. In December, Vivian asked him to present at the annual investor briefing. Not the technical portion, the whole thing. The company's story, where it had been, where it was going, what the infrastructure now made possible. He almost said no. Then he didn't. He stood in a conference room in front of 32 investors and 3 board members, and he talked for 22 minutes about a network infrastructure and what it could support and what it couldn't and what the plan was for the next 3 years. He didn't use the word journey. He didn't use any of the words that meant nothing while sounding like they meant something. He used the words for the actual things, and he talked about the audit, and he talked about what they'd found and what they'd fixed and what it had cost and why it had happened and what was different now. Afterward, Elaine Park came up to him again. "That," she said, "was the most honest investor presentation I've heard in 15 years. "The investors might not find it reassuring," Mason said. "The right ones will," she said. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he thanked her and went to find coffee, and Vivian appeared at his elbow and said quietly, That was exactly right. You think so? I know so. She looked at the room where investors were clustered in the way investors clustered, talking to each other and to board members and occasionally looking in their direction. 3 of them have already texted me, all positive. Huh, Mason said. Were you worried? He thought about it honestly. I was worried I'd be bad at it. The presenting part. You weren't. I know. I was surprised. She looked at him. Why? You explain things clearly in every other context. Why would a large room be different? Because in every other context I know the person I'm talking to, he said. A room full of investors it's an abstraction. They're people, she said. Same as the room full of engineers at 3 in the morning. You managed that. He thought about that room. Kevin and Torres and Pham and the status wall going red. The temperature curves, the 47 clients, the way the fix had to be done in sequence, each step building on the last, nothing rushed. That felt like work, he said. This felt like... He paused. I don't know what this felt like. Like your work mattered to more people than you usually have to face directly, Vivian said. He looked at her. She was looking at the room, not at him, and her expression was the particular expression he'd come to recognize as the one she wore when she was saying something real, not something professional. Yeah, he said. That's about right. He drove home that evening through December traffic, which was bad in the particular seasonal way. Everyone in a hurry toward something. The lights already up in the storefronts and the cold air finally feeling like something other than the absence of August heat. He picked up Chloe from the after-school program at 5:30, and she got in the car and buckled herself and told him immediately, and without preamble, that she had learned that octopuses had 3 hearts, which she found both interesting and excessive. 3, she said. Why do they need 3? Different compartments need different circulation, he said. 1 is for the whole body, 2 are for the gills. She thought about this. What if 1 breaks? The others can compensate. Partially. She looked out the window. Is that why systems have backups? He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was 7. She had learned the word system from him at some point in the past year and had started applying it to everything, including the organizational structure of her classroom and the way the cafeteria served lunch. That's exactly why, he said. So if something breaks, you don't die. Right, you have time to fix it. She nodded, satisfied, the way she always was when a new fact connected to something she already understood. It was her version of the feeling he got when a routing configuration seated correctly, the quiet click of things in right relation to each other. They got home and made dinner, pasta with the jarred sauce that Chloe preferred over the homemade because she was 7 and had opinions about texture, and they ate at the kitchen table, and she told him about the octopus book, and he listened. And afterward he helped her with the reading assignment, and she helped him, without knowing she was helping him, by existing in the specific way she existed, which required him to be present in a way that nothing else did. He thought about Elena sometimes, in the evenings like this, not with the weight he used to think about her. That weight had shifted over 4 years, was still there but distributed differently, like load across clusters. He thought about her the way you thought about someone who had been important, and who had left a shape in things, not a wound so much anymore as a permanent feature of the landscape. She would have liked the drawing on the fridge. She would have been very funny about the birthday party with 12 children. She would have had sharp opinions about Vivian Sterling, and he thought, based on those opinions, she probably would have respected her. He didn't know any of this for certain. He just thought it, and thinking it was okay. It wasn't a wound, it was just a thing that was true, that he had loved someone and lost her, and that he had raised a daughter who had 3 heart facts about octopuses and strong views on diagonal sandwiches, and that all of this was what it was. He wasn't managing it anymore. He was living inside it. After Chloe was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his phone and looked at the system monitoring dashboard, the one that showed him, at a glance, everything about the health of Titan Grid's infrastructure, green across the board, all 12 clusters, all 47 clients, the thermal curves flat and stable, well within the ranges he'd designed them for. He looked at it for a moment, the way you looked at something you'd built when it was working exactly the way you'd intended. Then he put his phone away. There would be something tomorrow. There was always something, some reading drifting, some configuration that needed attention, some question from Torres or Pham that would require him to pull up the reasoning behind a decision made years ago. That was the nature of the work. It was never finished. Systems didn't finish, they just operated until they didn't. And the job was to keep them operating, and to build them in ways that made the operating sustainable without any one person being the only thing standing between function and collapse. He'd done that. He was still doing it. The difference now was that the knowledge was in the documentation and in Kevin's notes, and in Torres watching the thermal curves every afternoon, and in Pham knowing why the failover had to be checked before the load restore. The difference was that the work was built into the team now, not just into Mason. That was the thing he was proudest of, and he wouldn't have said it out loud to anyone because it wasn't the kind of thing he said out loud. But it was true, and he knew it was true. And it mattered more than the title or the number on the piece of paper or the investor presentation where Elaine Park had said the most honest briefing in 15 years. He'd turned the knowledge into something that could survive him. That was the job. That was always the job. Even when nobody told you that was the job. He got up from the table and turned off the kitchen light and went down the hall and looked in on Chloe the way he did every night, which was the kind of habit you didn't think about anymore, just did. The way you did any number of things that had long since stopped being decisions and become the structure of your actual life. She was asleep with both arms out, the falling in slow motion position. The mirror book was on her nightstand, and the card from Vivian was propped against the lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to bed. And somewhere across the city, in a glass and steel building with a marble lobby and a status wall that had been, for a while, very red, 47 major corporate clients were running their evening operations through a network that was stable and documented and understood, and that had been built years ago and then again more recently in the ways that counted, by a man who had carried out a cardboard box on a hot August afternoon and come back at 3 a.m. because the work wasn't done and the system wasn't safe, and some things were too important to let the uncomfortable parts stop you. The lights were green, the father came home for breakfast. And the company, for the first time in a long time, knew exactly what it had.